For many years now, one of the most polarizing phrases in Sri Lanka has been the two words human rights. Our fellow citizens tend to divide into two camps. One camp says that human rights form the bedrock of our social contract with each other and those whom we elect to govern us. To the other camp, human rights is a pair of dirty words, a list of boxes that a government must reluctantly check, simply to placate external parties on whom we depend, like the United Nations or the European Union. This is why today, a government that has trampled on the rights of its citizens flagrantly and extrajudicially, sidestepping and bulldozing public institutions and courts of law since his first day in office, is suddenly talking about human rights as a way of salvaging the GSP Plus concession and preventing an international relations debacle at the upcoming session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Whenever we talk about human rights in Sri Lanka, it is usually talking about these words, about Geneva, about the UN, about GSP Plus. We may have strong opinions on whether these places, institutions and concessions are in Sri Lanka's interest or not. How much our country should bend to the will of others for economic concessions is a fair topic for reasonable political debate. But what boggles the mind is that in none of these discussions do we ever pause to think about what these human rights really are. Whose rights are they? And where the entitlement to these rights come from? If we really understood the answers to those questions, it should be completely obvious that every Sri Lankan citizen should insist on governments upholding human rights. The concept of human rights flows from the very birth of our country, of our national identity, when as a people of multiple genders, ethnicities, religions and ages, we chose to be organized as a country after independence. We chose also to be governed by a constitution, a supreme law, that every law and every man, woman and child in Sri Lanka is sworn to respect, uphold and defend. In this supreme law, we have decided as a society that every human being on Sri Lankan soil has a certain entitlements that cannot be infringed. We have the right to think what we wish or to practice any religion. We have the right to never be tortured, the right to be treated equally by all laws and to be protected equally by the law. We have the right to never to be arrested or locked up except as permitted by law. We have the right to be presumed innocent of a crime until proven guilty in court. As our society has evolved, we have amended the Constitution to give our citizens even more rights, like the rights to information introduced by the 19th Amendment in 2015. We gave ourselves these rights and we elect governments on the condition that they will uphold and defend our rights. Sri Lankans took these rights so seriously that we call them not just human rights but fundamental rights. Our constitution has a provision almost unheard of anywhere else in the world. When someone's fundamental rights are violated, we have another right we can invoke, which is to take our case immediately to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. In many ways, what is asked of Sri Lanka by the United Nations or our democratic allies, who buy most of our exports, whether the US, UK, Europe, Japan or India, is no more than for our governments to uphold the rights enshrined by our Constitution. When these countries see journalists being killed by the state for exercising their right to free speech, or poets, lawyers, church workers and activists be locked up on bogus charges by governments that use the law and police as a weapon to retain political power, they ask only that those responsible for these crimes be held accountable. and that governments defend the rights of these citizens rather than violate them. The very birth of United Nations and the genesis of Universal Declaration of Human Rights came from the dreadful experience of two world wars in which millions were killed because governments in some countries were allowed to treat their citizens as their private property, detaining them, torturing them, and killing them as they saw fit. As a community of nations, democratic nations around the world signed up to the idea that the rights of individuals must be protected above all else. Like any other geopolitical commitments, there has been a history of double standards. Economically powerful countries have gotten away with oppressing their citizens in a way that governments in poor countries have not. This is a point we hear very often from so-called nationalists in Sri Lanka. They claim that the same countries and institutions who give Sri Lankan governments a hard time for oppressing our citizens turn a blind eye to abuses by governments in countries that control oil or natural resources. Even if we accept this as the case, it makes no sense under any circumstances that Sri Lankans should defend their rulers for trying to take away their own rights. Everywhere in the world where governments get away with oppressing any one group of people, they always try their luck with another. This is how democracies fall into dictatorship, inch by inch, with the consent of the governed. Today we are starting to see what happens when we give up our rights to leaders. We can see what happens when we fall for their empty promises and giving them the arbitrary power to discipline our society. Just like everywhere else in the world, throughout history, it only ever leads to disaster. Just in the last week, we saw two stories that have shown the entire world the depth of our depravity. The man who was in charge of Velikara prison in 2012 was convicted of orchestrating the systematic murder of prisoners and sentenced to death unanimously by a trial at bar. Think about what this means. In a country bound with allegations of ill-treating prisoners and prisoners mysteriously dying in custody or jumping out of buildings, a court found that the man entrusted by the state with the welfare of prisoners was actually responsible for killing them. We also found out last week of the horrifying ordeal of the young poet Ahnaf Jassim, who was locked up without charge for over 1.5 years before being released on bail. In a newspaper interview after he was released, this young man revealed how he was tortured by the police, who spent months trying to get him to falsely implicate Hejaz Hizbullah, a lawyer who has been jailed on bogus charges for so long that he has never once had a chance to lay eyes on his infant daughter. We have a government that has shown it is perfectly capable of delivering results and succeeding only when it comes to locking up, torturing, and punishing innocent people. They have been so hell-bent on victimizing those whose work and sometimes those whose very existence they find offensive that in the end they have no time or focus left to care about the plight of ordinary citizens. But this is a plight that we would never have found ourselves if Sri Lankans all cherished their human rights as inalienable and as non-negotiable. Many of those in power today were party to a criminal attempt to destroy our democracy and seize power during the 52-day crisis in 2018. Despite the entire country watching that attempt, and despite this government having campaigned on a platform of taking away our rights and claiming a right to discipline us, we as a country asked for it by a margin of millions of votes. The problem here is not just that the country voted for politicians who had a track record of trying to tear up our constitution and who had no regard for the inalienable rights of all Sri Lankans. The problem is that such a party is even tolerated by the electorate with such a dictatorial mission statement. Whatever other policy differences we have among our political parties, between capitalism and socialism, our choice of foreign allies, agriculture policies, or how to educate our children. We, as an electorate, must never again make space for those who seek to usurp our birthrights. That is a red line that we must never again cross. What we need is not for a big brother government to discipline our society, but as a society to insist on disciplining those who govern us and to make sure that they never dare to violate our rights again.